So, if the light is to enter transparent structure called neon, then the hollow space is the pupil, which is surrounded by the iris. Then the lens, and behind the lens is this entire gel mass, that is the vitreous body. After the light crosses the vitreous body, the light should fall on a particular point of the retina, exactly straight ahead, and that particular point would be a yellow spot. It is at that spot which is having the maximum visual acuity. That means if light falls on that spot, then you can see your surrounding very clearly. If light doesn't fall onto that spot, then you would be seeing things as blurry. The way the viewed experience by opening the specs. As this person opens the specs, the image, the entire world becomes very blurry, right? Why? Because after they open the specs, the light doesn't fall. They enter into the cornea, but the light doesn't fall onto the yellow space. Either the light falls in front or towards back. Here. One more clarification that I want to make just to end this session. Your legs have started to pain heavy. That's why you are lifting your legs up and down. Anyway, that is, with all the cerebral series, that inside of the eye here is the yellow color, which is not true. In real eye, inside is entirely black. Why is it black? Here, sorry? Fully?
Nothing is there inside.
Not only that, the reason is there is a pigment, bronchopigment pigment. That pigment is melanin. That is also present inside the eye. It is a physiological visual requirement. You have visited your movie theater halls. You have never visited any theater hall. You have never visited a movie. You are lying.
No, sir.
How is it possible that you never visited a movie? You have never visited. What happens when the movie starts? The entire hall becomes dark.
Yes.
Why is that?
The light reflection of basically
Light is scattering afterwards. Similarly, we need to ensure that this entire hall of the sound becomes dark, remains dark. So that light from various different directions get absorbed. And only the light that is falling straight from the front is falling onto the yellow spot. So as to have the maximum of visual acuity. Okay. So to receive this light, there are certain cells present, and those cells are the cells of you can call them as photoreceptor cells. Two types of cells mostly, rod cells, not rod cones, okay, but rod cells and cone cells, of which cones contributes to the color perception. Okay, there are basically three types of cones. In nature also there are three types of colors fundamentally, RGB. So then there are three types of cones that accounts for multiple shades of colors that you can see. And there is the rod cells which can perceive whatever is present in the sound. What it basically does is when the light falls into the cells present in the retina, it gets transduced. Try to recall, in the last class on nervous system, I explained what is transduction. That is conversion of a physical stimuli to a nervous impulse. And that nervous impulse is communicated to the base of the brain, and from the base of the brain back to the occipital lobe. Okay, so stop the recording.
if I need a touch.
It's freezing over.
স্যার এটাকে খুলে কেটে দিন হয়ে যাবে।
Okay. Can you see me now? Can both of you see me now? Can you, okay, I can ask him here also.
Yes,
So,
sir.
please okay, Aditya Raj. Can Aditya Raj see me?
Yes. Yes, sir.
See me as well as this torso. Aditya Raj. Okay, good.
Yes, sir.
It's on the recording. Let me switch the recording. Check whether the recording is on, Aditya.
Yes, sir. Recording is on. Yes, sir. Recording is on.
Fine. Okay. Move towards that side because it's not possible for me to run this entire big structure. We are now going to demonstrate the nervous system. Right? As I was discussing this morning, the nervous system is a hollow structure. Nervous system is a hollow because it consists spaces in between. The names of the spaces are ventricles. But the word ventricle is typically used when we refer to the spaces of this particular organ of the nervous system, that is the brain. But below the brain, there is a continuous cord-like structure. That cord-like structure is known as the spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, there also is a hollow structure. And that hollow canal is known as the central canal of the spinal cord. The brain, as well as the spinal cord, taken together, known as the central nervous system, is not only hollow, but is also at the same time surrounded, even on the outside, by fluid. You know, very important fluid for you people all. Because you need to draw this fluid.
Cerebrospinal fluid.
There is a cerebrospinal fluid. That cerebrospinal fluid is present inside the brain, as well as I said, present outside the brain. If I show the brain, you will find like at least you cannot see anything that is hollow, right? The brain is having three surfaces. The surface that I am now showing you on is the inferior surface because the brain usually is present. Something like this. The way our skull is present, much like that way, is the brain present. Okay. Let me show you the skull at the same time to give you a better and proper orientation. This skull, it is a hollow cavity, the cranial cavity. So the model that I am having, a part of the skull can be removed from this skull. And what opens up this hollow space is entirely the cranial cavity. Okay, the structure called the brain is present something like this. I mean, since these two are not, I mean, we are not connected to a person, right? These are all artificial specimens. So that's why this is not fitting into the given system. But in reality, this entire brain fits into the skull. And over this brain, this topmost part of the skull is present somewhere. There is no hollow. Okay. So, with this orientation, I think it will be very easier for you to identify the different poles of the brain. What are poles, by the way? See, the brain is having a kind of convection, convex. So if anything is convex, there will be a point of maximum convexity, and that point of maximum convexity is known as pole. So this is the convex. So the maximum convexity is in this front. This entire lobe is known as the frontal lobe. If we place the skull on this plane, the bone that we get is the frontal bone. Correct? Similarly, if you take the other surface of the bone, that is, say, this surface is known as the superolateral surface. In the superolateral surface, this side is known as the temporal side. This is known as the temporal lobe, and the frontmost convexity of the temporal lobe is known as the temporal pole. Here, even if you take the back side, this part would be the entire occipital side. Accordingly, this lobe is the occipital lobe, and against it there is a convexity. Maximum point of convexity would be termed as the occipital pole. Understood? The concept of the different lobes of the brain, poles of the brain, and I also mentioned, do not explain, there is a surface. This particular surface from the side is known as superolateral surface.
video so अच्छा ना
Huh?
sir video so अच्छा ना
স্যার এখানে ভিডিও পজ করে দিয়েছি
কে পজ করে দিয়েছে?
তো কাজ করুন
Who has paused the video?
কাজ মিটছে না
কি হয়েছে ব্যাপারটা?
স্যার ওখানে ভিডিওটা পজ করা হয়ে গেছে মানে
পোস্ট দিয়ে দিয়েছ কি করে? আবার কেটে স্টার্ট করবো?
কেটে না আপনি খুলে টাচ না নিলে খুলে ওটাকে শুরু করে দিন হয়ে যাবে এটা ভিডিও অফ করা হয়ে গেছে আমাদের মধ্যে কেউ জয়েন করিয়ে সেই যদি ভিডিওটা অন করে
করো তো করো।
ভালো মোবাইল তারা যদি শুনতে না
ওরা ভিডিওটা অন করতে পারবে? ওদের কাউকে বলো ভিডিওটা অন করতে। এই অদিত্য বা পৃথা, ট্রাই টু টার্ন দ্য ভিডিও
না
অন।
না স্যার এখানে যারা আছে তাদের মধ্যে ওরা তো বাড়িতে আছে না তো ওরা এখানে আপনাকে দেখাতে পারবে না
ও আচ্ছা, কিন্তু রেকর্ডিংটা সবাই দেখতে পাবো তো?
হ্যাঁ
মেন হচ্ছে রেকর্ডিংটা হবে।
এখান থেকেই তো বলছি একটা
ক্লাস থেকে আসছো?
হুম,
মোবাইল দেন অ্যাপেলটা বের করে তার লাস্ট
Okay, Pritha Bhavik has started the recording. So let us continue with this one.
স্যার দেখা যাচ্ছে
তো কি আমি অফ করবো?
স্যার আপনার
হ্যাঁ, আমারটা শুরু হয়ে গেছে।
আমি স্যার একটা অফ করে থাকি এই কোম্পানি শুধু ভিডিও অডিওটা
ইকো হচ্ছে।
হ্যাঁ স্যার দেখা যাচ্ছে
Let's resume now. Speaking of different surfaces of the brain, the surfaces that we can see right now from the side is obviously the lateral surface.
সুইচ কোথায় আছে দেখি স্যার
কেটে দিই তাহলে ভিডিওটা চলবে তো?
হ্যাঁ না না স্যার আপনি করে করে ফ্রন্ট ক্যামেরাই ঠিক আছে ভালোই ভাবে দেখা যায় এটা স্যারের ক্যামেরা ধরুন একটা পিন করে দিই এই তো স্যার হ্যাঁ স্যার
রেকর্ড হচ্ছে তো?
হ্যাঁ স্যার রেকর্ডিং চলছে
রিডিং স্টার্ট করে দেন
চলছে স্যার
ক্লিয়ার না হচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ স্যার
এক্স্যাক্টলি
রেকর্ডিং চলছে চলছে ঠিক আছে
So let's resume, okay? Things probably have everything settled. So let's resume discussing the surfaces of the brain. Now, this brain do have three surfaces. Three. Of the three surfaces, the one that we are seeing right now is the superolateral surface. We call this as the superolateral surface because we are seeing the side aspect of the brain, as well as you can see the top aspect of it. So as if the top aspect is gradually sloping sideways. Thus, the name of this surface is the superolateral surface. So we are having this right superolateral surface, this one, and the left superolateral surface. Okay. In addition to that, there are two other surfaces. Let me show the other surfaces. I mean, if I hold the skull this way, this gives us an inferior view of the skull. This is the inferior view. Or you can also call this view as the base of the skull. That is simply by rotating, we are transforming the view from the frontal view to the inferior view. Okay. now this what you are seeing in the camera or is the inferior view of the skull, or the base of the skull. But I intend to show you the appearance of the base of the brain on the skull. So here you see this is what I have received after removing the skull. This particular view is the base of the skull view. We can also call this as the inferior view. Or the entire surface that we see here right now, this entire surface is the inferior surface of the brain. Or we can also call it as the base of the brain. Yeah. So there are two I have mentioned. One is this inferior surface, another is the superolateral surface. Now, apart from that, the brain can be split. See, gradually I am splitting the brain into two parts. Put it down. So on the split, the brain can actually be split this way. Even in this torso, we can see a part of the brain. Okay. So on splitting, we find that this superolateral surface, on coming to this midline, is bent sharply as the third surface. So the third surface that generates from here, what you are seeing here are the two medial surfaces. Understood? The medial surface. So the superolateral surface, inferior surface, this one, and here is the medial surface. Okay? Accordingly, we can have two borders. As for example, here is a border. The locations of the border are where the each surfaces are ending. যেখানে surface শেষ হচ্ছে সেখানে border. As for example, look into this room. There is the floor, one surface, and there is this vertical wall. There is a border. Right? Similarly, the superolateral surface and the medial surface ends in a superior border. So this is the superior border. This is the inferior border. Clear? Now the important things to know about this brain is that on the surface, let me bring the structure of the brain more close to the camera. That there are multiple depressions, linear depressions, line kind of depressions in there. And these multiple linear depressions are known as Sulci. Sulci is the plural word. Singular word for sulci is sulcus. Okay? Basically, this sulcus represents the areas where a straight surface undergoes a fold. I mean, you can take your handkerchief and can fold the handkerchief. So exactly along the line of the fold, you do not see a dark line. So these are the areas of those lines where the handkerchief has been folded. Clear? Is the concept clear?
Yes, sir.
Now, in between two consecutive folds, there will be an area of elevation, and those areas of elevations are known as gyres, or plural is gyri. It might be a bit confusing, so let me use this as a pointer. This one is the sulci. These depressed areas, depressed lines represent the sulci. In between two depressed areas, as for example, this is a depressed area, this is a depressed area. In between two depressed areas, this elevated part, this one, is a gyrus. Yeah, the difference between sulci and the gyrus. I mean, sorry. The more improved the brain, the more is the number of sulci and gyrus. Having the sulci and gyri more in number, it represents that the surface area is even more. Whatever the large brain be, or however the brain be large, the entire mass will have to get accommodated within this cranial cavity. And the cranial cavity is not increasing in size, but the brain can increase in size. I mean, what I am speaking is in terms of the evolutionary process. The more higher the animal, the more complicated the brain. Humans is having one of the most complicated. Having so many diverse functions, which the other animals cannot perform. Right? Now, having a control on so many different diverse functions obviously would make the brain much more complicated. Having more complications means having more surface area. Now, that surface area needs to be accommodated within this cranial cavity. And since that limited cranial cavity would have to accommodate a large surface of the brain, there are multiple sulci and multiple ventricles. Did you understand what is the necessity of sulci and ventricles? এই ভাঁজগুলোর উদ্দেশ্যটা কি? একটা বড় জিনিসকে ছোট জায়গার মধ্যে ভাঁজ করে। That is what you do, right? When you arrange our clothes in our almirahs, আমরা কি clothes-গুলোকে যাতে fold করে রাখবো, তত baking clothes limited space এর মধ্যে। Same concept. Okay, now is the important concept that the brain is a hollow organ. In order to show this hollowness, I would have to split the brain into multiple parts. This model here is a very good one that will be very highly illustrative of the hollowness of the brain. Before we split it, let me give you the idea of a cerebral hemisphere. This one, if I split this piece, becomes one hemisphere. If I place the brain this way, then this one becomes my right side. Accordingly, this is the right cerebral hemisphere. This one is accordingly the left cerebral hemisphere. Did you understand the concept of a hemisphere? In Bengali, you might have heard about Guru Mastishka and Lobi Mastishka. Now, in this brain also we are having both the Guru and the Lobi Mastishka. Cerebrum, that is the English of the Guru Mastishka, and Bengali is Lobi Mastishka for the cerebellum. We are having the representations of both the cerebellum and the cerebrum. Here you see, if I remove these two pieces, on removal of these two pieces, what I have removed is the cerebellum. Okay, so how this present? This cerebellum is present below the inferior surface of the posterior lobe or the occipital lobe. So this is the occipital lobe. Just now I was discussing about eye. The visual center through which we see is present at the back, at the posterior lobe. That's why if somebody hits you hard from the back side, you suddenly lose your vision. The entire world becomes dark and you fall into the ground. Right? Because this is the visual area. Not just beside the visual area, just below the visual area, this thing is the cerebellum, which also is having, have a look, this concept of hemispheres. It can be split from the middle into two surfaces. One is the right cerebellum hemisphere and the left cerebellum hemisphere. Yeah, the concept of hemisphere. Okay, now, how was it placed? This was placed something like this. Notice very closely that I am now showing you a hollow space. If we bring the structure more close to the camera, this is the brain stem, this was the cerebellum, and I am inserting my finger into a hollow space. Notice everybody. This hollow space into which I am inserting my finger, this hollow space continues upwards as ventricles. Inside the brain, we have total of 4 ventricles, of which 2 are lateral ventricles. Both those 2 ventricles are joined together to a 3rd ventricle, and the 3rd ventricle communicates downwards as the 4th ventricle. So, the area into which I have inserted my finger, basically the 4th ventricle. Yeah. So if we remove these structures, we can now gradually expose the 3rd and thereafter the lateral ventricles. So let us consider removing structures one by one. I am removing the cerebellum. So see, there is a depression in between this. Somebody hold this. Hold this. See, there is a depression in between these two cerebral hemispheres. This represents the fourth ventricle, the hollow space of here. This represents the fourth ventricle, and if I place it, is the hollow space now very clearly visible? Fourth ventricle space. Is there anything to lock inside the ventricles? Huh? I'm asking you. No. So why? What makes you smile? What is he doing? Tickling you.
Yes, sir.
You come and tickle me. Come here. Come here. Yes. Thank you. And now start tickling you. Okay, stand at the corner and spend the entire time of the class by tickling you. Okay. Well, so the tickling would also get recorded. The recorder will find out how well he can tickle. So the fourth ventricle is well demonstrated. So the doubts are the fourth ventricle that you are asking to Good. এই জায়গাটা হচ্ছে fourth ventricle, right? Fourth ventricle নিয়ে কোনো ডাউট? তো মন দিয়ে দেখবে কি করে আমি fourth ventricle থেকে দেখাচ্ছি। Cerebellum, I am removing the cerebellum. What am I now left with? In this inferior surface is a particular structure you see here. I can hold it this way. This structure, this projection, let me bring it more close to the camera, this one. This projection is as if the stem, it's a brain stem. Okay. So on the top of the brain stem, the most prominent structure that we get is, let me name one by one. If this be the brain stem, this topmost narrow part is known as the medulla. Medulla oblongata. What did I say? That this medulla is continuous with the spinal cord. This is the base of the skull. This big opening of the skull, known as the foramen magnum. Through this foramen magnum, the medulla is continued downward as the spinal cord. Yeah, something. Can you see that from the foramen magnum, the brainstem is visible?
Yes, sir.
Let me show it in the camera as well.
Yes, sir.
Point to the brainstem. From the foramen magnum, point to the brainstem. Somebody. Only the brainstem. Foramen magnum. This one is the brainstem. Correct? Okay. Now on the top of this medulla, see an area which is swollen. Bother about what's going on. Okay, tickling or what? Okay, tickling class. Instead of anatomy class, rather let's start with the tickling class. So this top part of the medulla, which is swollen, you know, fuller edge. Camera from the fuller area, this one. This is the narrowed part. This is the swollen part. Okay, camera from the negative record. So, a swollen part, this part is known as pons. P-O is pons baroli. The whole word. Okay, pons baroli. B-A-R-O-L-L-I. Pons baroli. Okay, now look very closely. Somebody hold it this way. Somebody hold it this way. We are seeing the inner surface of the brain. Let's go more close to the camera. We are seeing the inner surface of the brain. I am now going to remove the temporal lobe. I have removed the temporal lobe. On removal, see that there is an area in the temporal lobe, this one. Through this, a part of the brainstem was projecting on. Now I have removed the temporal lobe. Let me keep it separate here. After removing the temporal lobe, see that there is hollow. Now show it to the camera that there is hollow.
Yes, sir.
Notice.
Yes, sir.
These hollow areas are present in each of the cerebral hemispheres. Correct? So that's why these hollow areas are known as the lateral ventricles. According to you are having the right lateral ventricle and the left lateral ventricle. Understood? These two are the hollow areas. Now this part where I am putting my finger on, this is a roof of the hollow area. Right? And the brainstem was present something like this. That means these surfaces, the top surfaces, were the floors of the lateral ventricles. Did you understand? The boundaries of the lateral ventricles. The roof is formed by a particular structure that is known as striatum. Okay, I'll show you the striatum that is more clearly visible in that particular model. And the bottom is formed by the topmost surfaces of what you say, these structures. Doesn't it not look like that Haman? This is Haman.
Yes, sir.
Okay, these are known as the thalamus. Okay, a kind of ovoid mass, much like that of egg. In fact, the thalamus are separated front as well as behind. Right. So there will be a space in between these two side thalamus, and that space is the third middle. Did you understand? So on the top of the thalamus, we are having the two lateral ventricles. Okay? I mean, some tall person come and hold it this way. Okay. So on this holding, these were the hollow spaces. Invert and show into the camera the hollow spaces. To make it the hollow space. ঠিক আছে এই hollow spaceটা anatomical position কি থাকছে এরকম থাকছে সো এখানে আমি যদি এটা দিই এবার আমি থ্যালামাস গুলো দিচ্ছি তাহলে থ্যালামাসের যে উপরের সারফেস the superior surface it is forming the floors of the lateral ventricles তাই তো আবার এই থ্যালামাসের সামনের এই যে জায়গাগুলো in front these are the third ventricles. So don't you see that this third ventricle in the front is in communication to the lateral ventricles? Understood? So there is a small communication between these two lateral ventricles and the third ventricle. And this communication is known as foramen of Monro, or simply interventricular foramen, because this foramen is present out here, I mean in this location. And these are present in between these two lateral ventricles and the third ventricle. Did you understand that how is the brain hollow? Any doubts? Huh? Pause the recording for a second and now recall whatever I have taught so far regarding the ventricles. Thereafter I will take up that particular specimen. Give you all the ideas regarding ventricles.
Sir,
Pause.
না স্যার হবে না
Pause.
যতক্ষণ করবেন ততক্ষণই রেকর্ডিং চলবে
সেভ করে আবার এসে করা যাবে সেভ করে দাও
না একবারই থাকো একটা দিন 5 মিনিটের জন্য আবার কি সেভ করব
এই ফ্র্যাগমেন্ট অবস্থা থেকে ব্রেনটাকে রিকনস্ট্রাক্ট করো
হ্যাঁ স্যার
টোটাল জিনিসটা পাওয়ার জন্য দুটো সেরিব্রাল হেমিস্ফিয়ার এই সেরিব্রাল হেমিস্ফিয়ার গুলো কে যদি একটু দেখাই একটু মিডিয়াল সারফেসটাকে একটু ক্লোজলি দেখাই এটা মিডিয়াল সারফেসটাকে একটু ক্লোজলি দেখালে দেখো এখানে এটা দাগ জিনিস দেখতে পাওয়া যাচ্ছে
হ্যাঁ
show it to the camera as well
স্যার ওই
inside it
হ্যাঁ
and speaking of this area is known as the corpus callosum এই জায়গাটা হচ্ছে কর্পাস ক্যালোসাম। বেসিক্যালি কি হয় যে দুটোতে সেরিব্রাল হেমিস্ফিয়ার রয়েছে, দুটো সেরিব্রাল হেমিস্ফিয়ারের মধ্যে যে কমিউনিকেশন, the right sided brain and left sided brain are communicated via this corpus callosum, and just below the corpus callosum this part is a fine film like cloud pordar moto curtain. This is known as septum pellucidum, and this septum pellucidum is forming the medial wall of the lateral ventricles. দেখো এটা তো সেপ্টাম পেলুসিডামের জায়গাটা ছিল, কর্পাস ক্যালোসামের নিচের দিকে বলেছিলাম সেপ্টাম পেলুসিডাম। দিস ইজ দ্য কর্পাস ক্যালোসাম, দিস ইজ দ্য সেপ্টাম পেলুসিডাম, and here is the lateral ventricle. This entire space is the lateral ventricle, তাই তো? তাহলে lateral ventricle এর এইটা হচ্ছে medial surface, এটা হচ্ছে lateral surface. This surface is the lateral, this is the medial. So the medial wall of the lateral ventricles are formed by this structure. This structure is the septum pellucidum, which is hanging from the corpus callosum. ঠিক আছে? Now let me join and give you the idea. These are the ventricles, the two lateral ventricles, of which the medial partition is formed by the septum pellucidum. Clear?
Yes, sir.
The base is formed by the thalamus. These are the two thalamus, egg-shaped structures. This is forming the base. And see how closely this actually gets inserted into this base. এবার দেখো তো সবকটা স্পেস গুলো ক্লিয়ার হচ্ছে কিনা। এখানে একটা জায়গা ফাঁকা, নোটিস এভরিবডি ইন দ্য ক্যামেরা, this is the empty space. Okay, now that empty space is communicating in the front. এই দেখো frontal communication টা সামনের দিক থেকে, this front communication between these two thalamus. So this is the third ventricle. এখন যতটুকু জায়গা দেখতে পাচ্ছ এটা হচ্ছে third ventricle. If you even show it to the camera, that this one is the third ventricle. This space এর দিকে একটু পয়েন্ট আউট করো, third ventricle টা দিকে একটু পয়েন্ট আউট করো, third ventricle টা দিকে স্পেসিমেনে।
এই সে এখানে
হ্যাঁ, this is the third ventricle. Okay, this is the third ventricle, and as it continues downwards এরকম একটা লোকেশন আছে, এই যে লোকেশনটা এখানে পয়েন্ট আউট করো, এটা হচ্ছে fourth ventricle এর লোকেশন। এই fourth ventricle টা কি করে অ্যাপ্রিশিয়েট করা যাবে? কারণ এই fourth ventricle এর পেছনের দিকটাতে কি থাকবে? সেরিবেলাম। তো fourth ventricle টা ঠিক আছে। এখন একটু এই স্পেসিমেনটাতে আসি দেখাবার জন্য।
সব ছড়িয়ে যায়
এটা সামনে নিতে হবে। Now, in this particular specimen, I have removed one piece of the cerebral hemisphere. That means the right side of cerebral hemisphere is now removed, and on removal, the medial surface is getting exposed, and the corpus callosum here it is colored as red. এটা মানে কোনো কালার ছিল না, স্পেসিমেনে শুধু রেড কালারটা রয়েছে। The corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, and the thalamus. See, এখানে একটা egg-shaped structure, and the thalamus is also visible. So this is the level. At this level, or in the specimen at this level, the lateral ventricle is present. তাই তো? এটাকে দেখলাম septum. Thalamus-এর মাঝখানে, মানে এইদিকে একটা thalamus of the left cerebral hemisphere, and this is another thalamus of the right cerebral hemisphere. In between these two thalamus, we are having the third ventricle present, and even below that, not shown in the specimen though, shown partially. This is the thalamus. If this be the thalamus, below the thalamus out here, this is the area of the fourth ventricle. So this is how all the different ventricles are present in the brain. Now, the thing that I want to emphasize is, যে এদিকে একটু পাশে এই যে জায়গাটা দেখা যাচ্ছে, this is the skull diplobe. What is skull diplobe? Skull diplobe means এটা যদি আমার skull হয়, এই যে skull এর যে thickness-টা, এই thickness-টাকে বলা হচ্ছে diplobe. এই thickness-টা আমি মাঝ বরাবর এখান থেকে দেখতে পাচ্ছি. This is the skull diplobe. And this is the outermost surface of the brain. খুব ভালো করে দেখবেন এখানে একটা নীল জায়গা রয়েছে। এখানে একটা নীল দিয়ে দেখানো রয়েছে, মানে skull diplobe আর ব্রেনের মধ্যখানে এই যে নীল যে জায়গাটা, this particular blue space is the meningeal space. Meningitis হয়, শুনেছি বলে ডাক্তার না? So this brain is covered by 3 meninges. Okay. Immediately adjacent to this cerebral mass is pia mater. বুঝা গেল? Pia mater. কোন সময় যদি অনলাইনে পাই ছবি দেখাবো। Pia materটা একদম স্বচ্ছ, মানে কি বলবো, এটা এতটাই স্বচ্ছ যে এই ব্লাড ভেসেলস গুলো দেখা যায়। ওকে, so of surrounding the pia mater is another layer of meninges that is known as arachnoid. দেখো এখানে দুটো স্পেস দেখাচ্ছে, দুটো স্পেসের মধ্যে একটা বাউন্ডারি রয়েছে। তো এই যে বাউন্ডারিটাকে তুমি arachnoid লেয়ার বলতে পারো, ঠিক আছে? তাহলে arachnoid আর এই ব্রেনের মধ্যে যে জায়গাটা, arachnoid আর pia mater-এর মধ্যে যে জায়গাটা, this is known as the subarachnoid space. और ये arachnoid এর বাইরের যে লেয়ারটা, এটা নাম হচ্ছে dura, subdural space. বিষয়টা হচ্ছে কি, এটা দেখাচ্ছে কি, তো তুমি এইভাবে করতে পারবে কি আদৌ? মুন্ডুটাকে পুরো খোলা যায়, খোলা মুন্ডু। Now see, have a look on this খোলা মুন্ডু. Now that this blue colored spaces are present even over the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum. আচ্ছা, কেউ একজন একটু অনলাইনে জয়েন করে দেখো তো সেরিবেলাম প্রেজেন্ট আমি যখন বলছি দেখতে পাচ্ছ নাকি?
ওটা নিচটা কোন?
স্যার দেখা যাচ্ছে।
দেখা যাচ্ছে, ওই তো।
স্যার আপনি একটু এ করুন।
আমি এরকম করব?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, এবার ঠিক আছে। আরে আর লাড়াস না, ছেড়ে দে।
আচ্ছা, এই হচ্ছে সেরিবেলাম। এটা বলতে চাইছি, এটা হচ্ছে এই যে স্পেসটা, এই স্পেসটা সেরিবেলাম আর সেরিব্রাম এই দুটোর মধ্যে প্রেজেন্ট। এই জায়গাটা, হ্যাঁ এবার আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি, এই জায়গাটাতে এই ব্লু কালার স্পেসটা প্রেজেন্ট। মানেটা কি কি দাঁড়াচ্ছে, যে এইখানে যে ব্লাড ভেসেলস গুলো রয়েছে, যেগুলোর নাম হচ্ছে কোরয়েড প্লেক্সাস, এইখান থেকে ফিল্ট্রেশন হয়ে যে ফ্লুইডটা আসবে, এই ফ্লুইডটা এই ল্যাটারাল ভেন্ট্রিকলসে থাকছে। I repeat, let me repeat, please maintain silence. Anybody tickling?
বাইরে হচ্ছে স্যার।
তো ওরা বোধ হচ্ছে হাসছে, খেলছে। আমিও খেলছি, বাট হ্যাঁ, খেলা উইথ দ্য খোলা মুন্ডু। So what I'm trying to say is, আবার ফোকাস আগে খুব ভালো দেখা যাচ্ছে, এই পজিশনটাকে খুব ভালো দেখা যাচ্ছে। This is the meninges, maintain silence, and see that the meninges is continuing downward, undergoing a fold just below the occipital pole. So just below the occipital pole, it is undergoing a fold, and then it starts occupying the space in between the cerebral hemisphere and the cerebellar hemisphere. So this is the cerebral hemisphere, this is the cerebellar hemisphere. In between these two spaces, the meninges are occupying here. And this is the area wherein the ventricular spaces, here the ventricles are present, because this is thalamus, here the lateral ventricles level is present. The ventricular spaces are in communication to the outside. Basically, the spaces that we call as the subarachnoid and the subdural spaces are in this area, in this particular area is named as choroid plexus. In this particular area, they are in communication to the ventricular space. What does that mean? The cerebrospinal fluid that is present in these hollow spaces of the brain can escape from this particular point to occupy this entire meningeal space. Is this concept clear now? That means what you can say, that the brain is floating inside a fluid. Outside the brain, this particular blue area is representing fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. And inside the brain, that means in this ventricular space, there also is the fluid, that same cerebrospinal fluid. Clear? This is significant. Why is this significant? See, outside it is guarded by the skull, and inside is the soft organ, the brain. So, as we nod our head like this, sideways, so as we nod our head in different directions, consider that a soft ball is present inside a hot bottle. So the soft ball naturally would strike against the inner walls of the hot bottle, correct? And would suffer damage. But if you place water inside that bottle and then keep that soft ball inside, no matter how hard you shake that bottle, the ball would never strike hard against the inside walls and thus would never suffer damage. That same situation is present here. The brain is a soft mass, which on the outside is guarded by the skull diplobe. But in between the skull diplobe and the soft cerebral mass, in this blue color, what is represented is a space which contains the fluid. That fluid that is going to buffer the soft cerebral hemisphere against the inner wall of the skull or the calvaria or the cranial cavity. Here, as well as inside, you are having that same fluid, so that the fluid can form in this area and can leak out from this area to this outside meningeal spaces. Now, when we need to collect as medical laboratory technologists, we need to collect this cerebrospinal fluid just to find out the biochemical abnormalities in the cerebrospinal fluid, because multiple brain disorders do get reflected in altered composition of the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's not possible to collect directly from these ventricles, because if we have to collect anything from the ventricles, that means what? We have to introduce our needle, our syringe, through all these layers directly into out here, which would cause damage to multiple different structures. Rather, if we can introduce the syringe out in this layer, it will be easier for us to collect the cerebrospinal fluid. No, MRI তে biochemistry কি করে বোঝা যাবে? Altered composition, সেটা তো MRI তে বোঝা যাবে। MRI তে structural abnormality বোঝা যাবে, soft tissue structural abnormality। কিন্তু biochemical কি changes হচ্ছে সেটা তো MRI তে ধরা পড়বে। তার জন্য তো তোমরা রয়েছো, specimen নেবে ল্যাবে, biochemical detection করবে, তারপরে বোঝা যাবে। ঠিক আছে? Now the thing is, this entire thing is not having any orifice, so you would not be able to introduce a needle. Now for that, to collect the CSF, we will move on to this back part of the torso. So in this back part of the torso, what you see out here, this is the vertebral column. I mean, one single vertebra is also shown. Now if we take one single vertebra, observe it that this is the vertebra. Inside this one single vertebra, there is a blue color cord. Okay, let me show you the cord. Longitudinally, this is the blue colored cord. Okay, this one. No, what I am touching? This one, this one. Touching the ends of this cord, ends of this blue colored cord. This is the spinal cord. And there are multiple such vertebra. And in between two consecutive vertebra, there will be a small hole that is known as the intervertebral foramen. Okay, give me the bone set of the vertebral column. Of the vertebral column. Vertebral column. Yes. These people are going to write a different text in which these words will be used. What is that? Oh,
ক্যামেরা দেখ বিয়ে বাড়িও ডাকবি রেকর্ডিং কোনো সমস্যা নেই বিয়ে বাড়িও ডাকতে হবে
see, I am showing you two different vertebra. but these two vertebrae are not in the order. Okay. In order to find the things in order, I will have to pick out all the vertebrae and have to put one after another to find the exact order. What I intend to demonstrate here is that if these two vertebrae be present one on top of each other, see that from the sides there is a foramen. Okay. Now the spinal cord is present the way that I am introducing my little finger in. This is the canal, and into this canal is the exactly that same representation is up here also. That if this white mass is the entire vertebra, through this white mass in this blue colored cord-like structure is the spinal cord. Okay. Now, what I'm trying to say is, this is one vertebra, and this is the another vertebra. Now, keeping both these vertebrae together generates a space in between these two, and this particular opening is known as the intervertebral foramen. In order to collect the spinal cord, we use this natural foramen. So if we are using this natural foramen, we are not causing any damage to any of the organs because the foramen present here is a natural foramen. Okay, in the lumbar part, so this is the lumbar part, this one is the lumbar part. In between the L4 and the L5, we introduce our syringe out here. Okay, the meningeal covering that was there on the top, lost or what? Oh no. This was the skull type, so the meningeal covering, though not very clearly shown here, but it is continuous downwards. It is continuous downwards along the sides of the spinal cord. That means both the sides of the spinal cord would also be having cerebrospinal fluid. বোঝা যাচ্ছে? এই যে meningeal লেয়ারটা উপর থেকে গিয়ে নিচ অব্দি বিস্তৃত। ইভেন এই লেয়ার এই জায়গাটা অব্দি meningeal খুব বিস্তৃত। ঠিক আছে? এইটা হচ্ছে স্পাইনাল নার্ভস গুলো, দেখো এই জায়গাটা একটা ঘোড়ার লেজের মতো দেখতে, অনেকগুলো ফাইবারস, দিস ইজ নট দ্য কর্ডা ইকুইনা। স্পাইনাল কর্ডের উপর আমার সেপারেট ভিডিও আছে, দেখে নেবে, কাকে পড়িয়েছি মনে নেই কিন্তু আছে, দেখে নেবে। আচ্ছা, তো এই স্পাইনাল কর্ডের দুপাশে যে জায়গাটা রয়েছে, এইখানে যে ফোরামেন, এগুলো সবই কিন্তু ইন্টারভার্টিকুলার ফোরামেন। আচ্ছা, এই যে ফোরামেন গুলো থাকে সব ইন্টারভার্টিকুলার ফোরামেন। এরকম একটা ন্যাচারাল ফোরামেনের মধ্যে দিয়ে আমি আমার সিরিঞ্জ ইউজ করে স্পাইনাল কর্ডটাকে এক্সট্রাক্ট করি। ঠিক আছে, স্পাইনাল কর্ড এক্সট্রাক্ট করি না, সরি, সেরিব্রোস্পাইনাল ফ্লুইডটাকে এক্সট্রাক্ট করি। ঠিক আছে, তো মোটামুটি দিস orientations of the spinal cord and the brain is clear. এবার আমাকে যেটা বলতে হবে সেটা হচ্ছে যে এখানে বিভিন্ন ধরনের যে সালসি এন্ড গাইরি গুলো রয়েছে তার আলাদা নাম হয়, এগুলো আজকে ইন্ট্রোডিউস করছি না। ঠিক আছে, এইটা আপনাকে বললাম। স্পাইনাল কর্ডের অনেক কিছু বলার আছে এখনো। ঠিক আছে, যেমন এই পার্টটা ইজ নন অ্যাজ দ্য সার্ভাইকাল স্পাইন, দিস ইজ দ্য থোরাসিক স্পাইন। ঠিক আছে, দিস ইজ দ্য লাম্বার, দিস ইজ স্যাক্রাম, কক্সিস ক্যানট বি শোন। Now, how do you know? Spinal cord কে আরেকটা দিন করব। ঠিক আছে, আজকে এই অবধি মিটিং কালে রেকর্ডিং এ করো।
রেকর্ডিং এমনি শেষ হয়ে যাবে।
এবার বলো, কার কি কোয়েশ্চেন আছে?